The series opens with a broadcast revealing that Hurricane Katrina has escalated to a Category 5 storm. Following this, scenes of boats navigating through the floodwaters and widespread destruction are shown. Through these brief yet impactful moments, the devastating reality of the situation is conveyed, making it difficult to watch without feeling sorrow. Subsequently, a team clad in hazmat suits arrives at a hospital, only to be confronted with the aftermath of the disaster inside. Upon entering a room marked with a warning to stay out, one individual discovers numerous lifeless bodies strewn across the floor. The scene shifts to the present, where Horace is being interrogated about the 45 deceased individuals discovered in the hospital. Horace recounts the harrowing 5 days following the storm, describing the dreadful conditions and detailing the chaotic events that unfolded within the hospital after Katrina. The interrogators are relentless, seeking answers about the deaths of these 45 people. As the pressure mounts, Horace struggles to articulate his thoughts, overwhelmed by the intensity of the questioning. Following the opening credits, the narrative takes us back to the hospital staff as they prepare for the imminent hurricane. Dr. Anna enters the hospital and heads to the nurse's room, where the team humorously critiques the small number of items she has brought, anticipating a potential extended stay. Anna admits that this is her first experience with a hurricane at the hospital and expresses hope that the situation won't be as dire as predicted. Meanwhile, outside, a few men are seen driving a metal stake into the ground to measure the rainfall, which currently indicates just over 1.5 feet. Inside the hospital, the incident commander, Susan, is gathering everyone to outline the forthcoming challenges. She emphasizes the rules and procedures they must adhere to in order to effectively care for the patients during the storm. Diane is seen conversing with another nurse about which patients require closer monitoring. She then visits one of her patients who appears to be recovering from her ailments. Following this, Dr. Anna is on the phone with her husband, expressing her wish for him to be with her instead of watching over their home. He reassures her that he needs to stay behind to protect their house and that they'll be reunited in a day or so. Meanwhile, Mark is driving home amidst the storm when a fallen tree obstructs his path, forcing him to take a detour. Upon reaching home, he and his wife are alarmed by a news report announcing a mandatory evacuation. This causes them to worry since Mark's mother is in the hospital. Diane then checks on Emmett, a patient who was mentioned as needing extra attention. They engage in a brief conversation about his family, ensuring he remains in contact with them. Mark, concerned for his mother, calls the hospital and manages to speak with her. She reassures him that she's being well cared for and mentions that her nurse, Jill, is right beside her. Unfortunately, their conversation is abruptly cut off as the phone signal drops. Next, Susan is with her mother, expressing her surprise at how overwhelming her responsibilities have become. As they talk, the flooding begins, with water seeping through the ceiling. Diane is the first to alert Susan about the leakage. Susan then confronts a man regarding the water intrusion, and he dismisses it as just windblown rain. Incredibly, he then mentions that their main concern is a flood and that if it happens, an evacuation will be necessary. Susan questions him about the evacuation procedure, but he admits he has no idea how to proceed. At this point, it becomes clear that Susan was unprepared for the magnitude of the situation she faces. She sits down with a hefty manual, trying to figure out the hospital's protocol in case of flooding. In a meeting with the hospital's senior staff, Susan informs them that the book contains no evacuation plans. She warns that if the basement floods, they will lose all their food and supplies, and if the water reaches 4 feet, the situation will become dire. The senior staff member reminds her that as the incident commander, all decisions fall under her authority. Chaos begins to unfold as the situation at the hospital deteriorates rapidly. Objects start flying around, and the rain intensifies, illustrating the full force of the hurricane. An elderly man, entranced by the storm, wanders to a window to watch, but Dr. Anna quickly finds him and guides him back to his room. Just as she settles him in, a deafening crash resonates through the building as something smashes through Susan's office window. The scene then shifts to the bridge connecting the two hospital wings, which is on the brink of collapse. Dr. Anna urgently calls Susan, who orders an immediate evacuation. As they scramble to evacuate, the water level has risen to over 3.5 feet. Karen frantically contacts Susan, urging her to get everyone out. Susan mobilizes the staff to gather all the food supplies in the basement and then instructs Horace to move patients from admitting to the second floor in a calm and orderly manner. Horace relays the urgency to Dr. Bryant, emphasizing the need for a swift but composed relocation. Amidst the chaos, Dr. Anna finds a terrified nurse in tears and bravely helps her across the perilous walkway. Everyone at the hospital remains alive, and that's the only hope they cling to at this moment. As Susan herself narrates in an interview, the ominous reality sinks in. The worst is still yet to come. The hospital staff breaks into a round of applause, celebrating a small victory. Although the water is beginning to be drained out, the broken air conditioning presents a new challenge. Susan urges everyone to stay hydrated and drink plenty of water to combat the rising heat. Footage of the city and the wreckage that tore up the town plays, with analysts noting that the hurricane didn't hit as hard as it could have. In the backdrop, Susan's voice narrates how everyone was relieved and happy because the hurricane didn't impact the hospital as severely as anticipated. However, the mood shifts as she is pressed by people asking if she had any interactions with Dr. Anna during and leading up to the hurricane. Susan reflects, "After we survived the hurricane, we thought we could survive anything, and we were wrong." Inside the hospital, Susan explains how the water is flooding in, but reassures everyone that they are working on it and that the hospital has held up relatively well, all things considered. She reminds everyone that it's hot due to the AC being out and urges them to stay hydrated. Tensions are rising with the increasing temperatures inside the hospital. Emmett tries to call his wife, but can't get through, worried that she might be confused due to their hospital transfer. The camera pans to show the severe flooding outdoors. Overheard conversations reveal that the lake waters are flooding, and most city residents are unaware. Life Care Hospital is facing leakage issues, and no one from Memorial has checked on them. Horace confronts Dr. Cook about someone seeing him with a gun. Dr. Cook claims he is protecting himself, but Horace cautions him to be mindful of those around him. Horace then mentions a patient who expressed concern about being discharged, reassuring the patient that if such a situation arises, he should come to him for help. In Dallas, a group of healthcare salespeople is gathered to discuss selling insurance to businesses. During the conversation, one of the men asks whether disasters like Katrina help or hurt their business. The question is deflected with a vague response, indicating that he really can't say, creating an odd moment that seems likely to resurface later in the show. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, a security guard warns a nurse to be cautious outside, mentioning that another nurse was recently harassed. The story quickly spreads among the staff, reaching Dr. Karen, who hears that someone was assaulted. Dr. Karen informs Susan that a nurse was assaulted and raped outside. Shocked, Susan confronts the security team, who claim this is the first they have heard of it. As the waters rise and stores are emptied, looting has begun, adding to the chaos and danger surrounding the hospital. 3 kids enter the hospital, and Dr. Bryant confronts them, asking what they are doing there. One of the kids shares a rumor that they are getting kicked out of the hospital and questions where they will find food once they're gone. Dr. Bryant then approaches Susan, who dismisses the rumors of rape or assault as untrue. Dr. Bryant expresses his concern about the possibility of discharging patients. Susan explains that they might have no choice but to discharge people, not kick them out once the flooding slows down. Meanwhile, Dr. Anna tries to call her husband, who doesn't answer, so she leaves a heartfelt voicemail for him. Outside, staff members check the height of the floodwater, which remains at 18 inches and hasn't receded as hoped. Mark calls Jill to check on his mother and learns that, despite the harsh conditions and lack of AC, the hospital staff is doing their best. Sandra reassures Mark that his mother is safer in the hospital than she would be stranded at their house. Susan experiences a breakdown, feeling as though she has let everyone down. However, Dr. Anna receives a pleasant surprise when her husband shows up at the hospital. Then we see everyone finding some comfort with loved ones, as they start to believe the worst is behind them. We even see Emmett on the phone with his wife, who offers him some comfort and reassurance. As everyone is settling in, Dr. Karen Wynn encounters a woman who was brought to the hospital with stab wounds. The doctors work to treat her, while Horace tries to comfort her distraught grandson, who explains that his mother stabbed his grandmother. Meanwhile, Dr. Anna's husband is trying to convince her to come home, but she refuses to leave her patients. Frustrated, he tells her he will go home to check on the house and then return to her. As he leaves, the news reports that while water levels aren't rising in some areas, they are increasing in others. Back with the insurance people, the man who was asked if disasters like Katrina were good for business bluntly responds, "Of course it was." Outside the hospital, as a couple of people survey the area, a few men approach and warn them that 15 feet of water is coming fast. Susan challenges the men, but they insist that this is imminent and an evacuation is necessary. Susan admits they don't have an evacuation plan for such a flood. She quickly takes command, rallying resources and preparing for what's ahead. The episode concludes with someone urging Dr. Anna to call her husband back as they observe a tide coming in, carrying all sorts of debris. Dr. King is interviewed about the incident at Memorial Hospital. He tells the interviewer that crises reveal true character, highlighting Anna and the events surrounding her in the hospital. It's day 3 inside the hospital, and Susan is contemplating a complete evacuation. With the city's water pumps broken and the water levels rising, she fears the floodwaters could reach the 2nd floor. She realizes that the only viable solution solution might be to leave the hospital entirely. However, with the water continuing to rise and some patients in urgent need of evacuation, Susan faces another dilemma. The helipad on the roof hasn't been used in years, and there might not be a way to evacuate the patients via ambulances. The situation is becoming increasingly precarious, leaving Susan and the staff scrambling for a solution. The situation is complicated by friction between Memorial and LifeCare, with LifeCare being in a much more precarious position regarding patient evacuation. Diane from LifeCare approaches nurses, seeking clarity on the evacuation plans. Given that LifeCare is a private hospital with most of its patients in critical condition, moving them isn't a viable option. Meanwhile, in Dallas, a group of businessmen, including Michael Arvin, receive emails from Memorial requesting evacuation assistance. While some of his co-workers dismiss the emails, Michael takes the matter seriously and discusses with his boss, Steve, whether they can facilitate the evacuation. Michael senses the gravity of the situation and immediately begins trying to arrange medical services for Memorial. Despite his efforts, he hits several roadblocks and eventually sends an email deflecting the responsibility to the National Guard. Nevertheless, Michael continues to do everything he can to secure help for the hospital. The reality is that New Orleans is a poor community, and as often happens, the wealthy tend to look out for themselves. Consequently, services are scarce as they move into the city. At Memorial, the only viable solution seems to be moving patients up to the helipad. However, this option is fraught with difficulty due to the steep climb and the deteriorated state of the helipad, which has not been used in years, adding to the already high tension among the staff and patients. From their vantage point, the workers notice severe corrosion on the helipad, which could pose significant problems for landing helicopters. Despite these concerns, the hospital must begin evacuations and prioritize which patients to move first. The National Guard has promised to transport 35 patients by truck, leading Susan to decide that those on life support should be prioritized. However, the helicopter evacuation plan faces limitations, as they can only move one person out. Michael learns from his boss that using private helicopters and assistance from the state of Atlanta is not an option. They believe the responsibility should remain with the military and National Guard. When the military truck arrives, it can only accommodate 20 patients instead of the promised 35. Anna chooses to stay at the hospital rather than evacuate, while the neonatal care unit staff begin the tense and challenging task of moving up to the helipad. The situation becomes dire as there are no helicopters available, and even worse, the generators are about to fail. Water continues to flood in, leaving patients stranded. Sandra sends an urgent message to Michael, pleading for immediate assistance. Suddenly, the power goes out. The fans stop, the ventilators cease functioning, and the evacuation plan is put on hold. Rumors of snipers outside circulate on the news, and frustrations reach a boiling point for the desperate residents without an easy way out. The situation is precarious. Susan breaks the bad news to Anna, explaining that although corporate is doing everything possible to arrange a rescue, the high water levels make it impossible to bring trucks back. The fire department, tired of waiting, decides to take matters into their own hands and start rescue operations. Amidst the chaos, one of the patients goes into cardiac arrest. Anna rushes through the dark hallways, trying to save him. Despite her efforts, the patient has been in distress for 10 minutes, and they ultimately lose him. With no power and the doctors working in darkness, it becomes clear that the situation will worsen before it improves. Real-life footage shows the people's distress over the incompetence of government bodies that seemingly ignored the population of New Orleans during the flood. Interviewers speak with Karen Wynn, the head of Memorial's ethics committee and the nurse manager of the ICUs. When asked whether patients were killed, she replies that the patients were helped to reduce their pain. On the fourth day, Dr. Anna administers morphine to a patient in the presence of Dr. Horace Baltz, who doesn't fully agree with her action. Anna explains to Horace that she cannot bear to see patients suffering from unbearable pain and heat. Despite the dire need, Memorial does not receive enough helicopters to evacuate all their patients. LifeCare's Diane meets with Susan, providing a list of her hospital's patients to include them in the evacuation plans. Michael is informed that the company hasn't requested the Coast Guard to evacuate LifeCare's patients. Diane confronts Susan about this, but Susan fails to provide a satisfactory explanation. Renee Gu instructs security guards not to allow anyone seeking shelter into the hospital. The guards scare off a group of people pleading to let a few children in by firing a gun into the air. Mike Bowles from the State Department of Hospitals arrives at Memorial, promising boats for evacuation starting the next day. He instructs Susan to prioritize evacuating patients who can easily move over the sickest to expedite the process. He also asks Susan and other administrators to categorize patients who cannot be saved, including Emmett. The people in the hospital are woken up by a false announcement claiming that boats are coming to rescue them. During the wait, several individuals have their personal belongings stolen. As an outsider, Bryant is shocked by the hospital authorities' authorities' actions, particularly Rene Gou's decision to deny the public entry for shelter. Although Rene attempts to justify his decision by explaining that the hospital's resources are too depleted to accommodate additional people, Bryant is appalled by the guards scaring off children with gunfire. He believes the hospital should offer help to the needy rather than shutting its doors to the most vulnerable. Moreover, Rene's decision to arm certain staff members further unsettles him. He views this as a descent into evil, as he believes doctors and hospital staff should comfort patients and their families rather than intimidate them with guns during a flood. Bryant communicates the dire situation at Memorial to his best friend through text messages, revealing that some staff members are starting to panic and even discussing the possibility of helping some of the long-term acute care patients die. The news broadcasts about hundreds of hospitals filled with patients stuck without resources, highlighting the state's failure and its toll on the entire city. Michael approaches his boss, informing him they haven't been able to contact anyone at Memorial. Determined to find a solution, Michael finally locates helicopters in Dallas that can reach Memorial. His boss gives him the green light to send them for the rescue. After the credits, we see Dr. Horace and Dr. Anna is trying to comfort patients whose conditions are worsening. Emmett is struggling to stay alive and anxiously asks if he will be evacuated or left behind. A doctor returns to inform Susan that no helicopters are coming, causing her to flip out in frustration. She cannot comprehend why no one has come to save them. Meanwhile, some staff members express concerns about their pets. Susan insists they must devise a humane way to take care of the animals and emphasizes the need to figure out a way to evacuate patients to prevent further suffering. Mark navigates a boat through the floodwaters, passing dead bodies floating in the water as he heads towards Memorial. Inside the hospital, Susan checks on Diane, who reports that they have lost a few more patients and are running dangerously low on supplies. Susan reassures her that the plan is to leave no living patients behind. Finally, Mark and his team arrive at Memorial on boats. As Mark enters to find his mother, a security guard pleads with him to take him back. Mark finds his mother unhooked from all medical equipment and wonders why. He carries her out and loads her into the boat, which can only accommodate a few patients. The security guard insists that everyone else stay back and at the last moment jumps into the boat, prompting others to call him a coward. On the way out, a woman asks Dr. Anna for advice on what to do with her dog. Dr. Anna begins to break down, unsure if she has the correct answer. Susan then approaches Dr. Cook about the humane way to help the animals. He explains that an injection of pentothal will put them to sleep permanently. Susan, questioning if this is the right thing to do, receives a sobering response from Dr. Cook, who emphasizes the need to be realistic about the grim situation ahead. Susan jumps for joy when helicopters finally arrive. The doctors at Life Care Hospital see the helicopters and, disregarding orders, start sending patients up. As they begin to bring patients, one doctor reminds a nurse that those with black bands, DNRs, are to go last. Meanwhile, Dr. Cook somberly puts down the animals one by one, a heart-wrenching task to witness. A nurse from Life Care explains to Dr. Anna that their patients are dying, including a lady right in front of them, because no one has informed them when their patients would be evacuated. Dr. Anna says she will watch over this patient. Next, we see doctors and nurses placing sheets over the heads of deceased patients. Susan admits that nothing has been put in place and she hasn't heard from anyone, essentially losing hope. Dr. Anna tells her she just watched another patient from Life Care die. Susan struggles to comprehend the lack of assistance, while Dr. Anna emphasizes that there is nothing left to do in-house except make the patients as comfortable as possible. Dr. Bryant approaches Emmett and reassures him that he will make it out like everyone else. A crew arrives by boat, informing them that rescue boats will come soon and everyone must be out by 5 p.m. Susan panics, realizing that this is not enough time to evacuate everyone. In a tense moment, Susan spreads the word to Dr. Anna about the mandate, who responds that it's never going to happen. Susan insists that if Anna hasn't spoken to Dr. Cook yet, now is the time. It's a harrowing implication that Susan is essentially giving the nod to consider euthanizing the patients who can't be evacuated. A nurse overhears Dr. Anna and Dr. Cook discussing the grim possibility and informs Dr. Bryant about their plan. The realization sets in that they won't be able to get everyone out in time, and they are considering ending the suffering of those who cannot be saved. The boats have arrived, and as they do, people begin making their way to evacuate patients one by one. The evacuation process finally gets underway. In a poignant moment, Susan sees her mom off, displaying a rare smile that reveals her raw emotion. Meanwhile, people work tirelessly to get patients up the steps to the rooftop and onto the helicopter. The end is in sight for many. Dr. Cook and his wife leave their dog behind, but as they board a boat, they see a woman bringing her dog on, which upsets his wife. Susan tells Dr. Horace that he has done his part and must evacuate with the next group. However, the security team begins to act aggressively, insisting that doctors and patients clear out immediately. One doctor asks Dr. Bryant to join them in prayer, but he declines, saying he has patients to care for. At that moment, he sees Dr. Anna injects patients with something, which infuriates him. Dr. Bryant packs a bag and decides to leave the hospital in anger. Meanwhile, a woman is told by security that it is time to go, but she pleads to stay with her mother. They force her to leave, and she begs to say her goodbyes in a heartbreaking moment. Dr. Anna informs the remaining doctors at Memorial that they are taking over the care of their patients. A nurse approaches Anna, expressing doubt that their patients will make it out. Dr. Anna tells Dr. Karen about the situation at Life Care, and they resolve to make the patients as comfortable as possible. Dr. Karen rallies everyone, reminding them that as doctors and nurses, they must do everything they can to evacuate their patients. At last, one of the largest patients at the hospital is finally being evacuated. Dr. Horace sits in the hot seat, ominously declaring that decisions were made after those 5 days that never should have been made. This spine-chilling opening sets the stage for the dissonant and tone-deaf response from President George Bush to the unfolding crisis in New Orleans. A series of montage news footage is seamlessly stitched together over his speech, capturing the contrast between his words and the grim reality on the ground. This beautifully edited sequence then transitions to Atlanta, 13 days after Katrina. Butcher is summoned to Baton Rouge to meet with the Attorney General, who wants to investigate what happened at Memorial Hospital. With 45 dead patients inside, the situation has raised significant concerns, prompting a thorough investigation. Joining him in this endeavor is Virginia Ryder, who works in the fraud department. As they receive evasive responses from Memorial's administrators and troubling reports from Life Care about morphine injections, the pair realizes they need to obtain Life Care's records and speak with Anna to uncover the truth behind the tragic events. Anna is having a meal with a Walker Shaw. With Memorial not reopening anytime soon, Anna finds herself in need of a new job. Walker offers her a position at a hospital in Tennessee. She eagerly accepts the offer without hesitation, wanting to jump straight back into work. In stark contrast, Susan, along with Karen and several other nurses, is tasked with phoning the families of the victims to deliver the awful news. They follow a scripted protocol to convey this devastating information. Meanwhile, Anna appears on TV, giving an interview about the patients and their deaths. Butcher listens to Anna's interview and remarks on how well-rehearsed it seems. Regardless, the interview gains mainstream attention, and CNN expresses interest in conducting their own interview with Anna. Virginia and Butcher decide to head down to New Orleans themselves. They find the city a desolate wasteland, with abandoned cars lining the roads and widespread destruction everywhere. Upon arriving at the hospital, they are stopped from entering. They are told they need a warrant and a hazmat suit to gain access, but they notice that the security personnel aren't even following their own protocols, raising yet another red flag. The focus then shifts to Anna, who prepares for the impending media storm by securing an attorney. She braces herself for the intense scrutiny and public attention that are about to descend upon her. She called Susan and told her CNN wants to interview her about a possible euthanasia in the hospital. Susan was hearing about this for the first time. She tried to reassure Anna and hung up. Horace is on the phone asking if a patient of his was on the list of the people that died, but he couldn't get any information. Butcher and Virginia eventually sit down with Diane, who provides a harrowing account of the events on day 5. Diane recalls Susan saying, "The plan is for no living patient to stay alive." Anna, she explains, was even more forthcoming, having told Diane that some patients would not make it, including Emmett Everett, who was conscious and aware of what was happening. Butcher is skeptical about the euthanasia story, finding it hard to believe. To get to the bottom of this, he and Virginia decide to interview more nurses. These nurses help to flesh out the story further, confirming the use of morphine and adding more details to the distressing narrative. The pharmacist provides a damning assessment of Anna, including an eyewitness report of seeing her come out of one of the rooms with needles in a clear plastic bag. Anna then asked him to check on the patients, the deceased ones, and to pull the sheets up over their heads. He is convinced that the patients were murdered, adding a significant and troubling piece of evidence to the investigation. Butcher and Virginia are interviewing Emmett Everett's wife, Carrie Everett. She emphasizes the need to solve the case to honor Emmett's memory, stating that her husband didn't just die, but was taken away from her. Butcher and Virginia search Memorial to assess the state of the hospital and discover unused stockpiles of water and canned food. After their search, they meet coroner Frank Minyard, who informs them that the bodies are too decomposed to collect viable blood samples for drug tests. Butcher and Virginia stress the importance of the case, convincing him to attempt to collect the samples despite the challenges. While Butcher and Virginia continue interviewing Life Care staff members, Dr. Bryant King steps steps forward and contacts them to reveal what really happened in Memorial Hospital during the flood. He informs the duo that he heard from his colleague Kathleen Fournier that Dr. Anna and Dr. Cook had implicitly discussed euthanizing patients. Bryant also tells Butcher and Virginia that he saw Dr. Anna with numerous syringes, adding a crucial piece of evidence to their investigation. The media broadcast stories about Anna's alleged involvement in the deaths continuously, making it difficult for her to appear in public. Walker Shaw, her boss at LSU, asked her to refrain from performing surgeries for a while. Although Anna initially follows the order, she eventually convinces Walker to retract it. Richard T. Simmons Jr. informs Anna that Butcher's case is increasingly pointing to her as the primary suspect. Anna went out for dinner with her husband, but she noticed that people were looking at her and felt uncomfortable. As they were sitting, her friend, Nora, along with her husband, approached and reassured her that she had her back and told her to remain strong. Butcher and Virginia persist in urging Minyard to test the samples from the dead bodies found in Memorial Hospital. Their efforts pay off when they receive toxicology reports proving the presence of morphine or midazolam in the bodies of 9 life care patients. Carrie went to see Virginia. She asked if there was any progress on the investigation. She then took out a picture of Emmett and gave it to Virginia. Virginia reassured her that they would do everything they could to find out what actually happened. To get a clearer understanding of the facts, Simmons, Anna, Sherry Landry, and Lori Budo visit Memorial. While Butcher and Virginia are at the hospital with Ken Nakamura, they inspect the pharmacy and discover a lack of stock for 2 critical drugs. Anna asked Nakamura to check the records, revealing that Anna was the last person to enter the pharmacy and take the drugs. Upon considering the testimonies of life care employees like Diane Robichaud, Therese Mendez, Christy Johnson, and Ken Nakamura, Butcher and Virginia identify Anna, Sherry Landry, and Lori Budo as the prominent suspects. Several months after their initial investigation at Memorial, Virginia arrests Anna. Anna is charged with 4 counts of being a principal in second-degree murder, specifically for the deaths of Emmett Everett, Rose Savoy, and 2 other life care patients. Dr. Horace Baltz speaks to the investigators, revealing that decisions made at Memorial Medical Center and life care hospitals during the crisis were profoundly wrong. He expresses his guilt over being evacuated early, leaving behind the chaos. Attorney General Charles Foti Jr. holds a press conference, declaring that the deaths at Memorial were homicides. Sherry Landry and Lori Budo, the nurses who accompanied Anna while injecting life care patients, were also arrested. Anna's attorney held a press conference. He stated that there was no homicide that happened, and the arrested medical staff are persecuted wrongfully. In the midst of the legal turmoil, one of Anna's colleagues calls her to tell her he is launching a defense fund to support her financially as she faces an enormous bail bond. Dr. Frank Minyard, the New Orleans parish coroner, seeks assistance from several external experts to classify numerous deaths at Memorial as homicides. Even though Butcher and Virginia hope for DA Jordan's intervention in the case, ADA Michael Morales becomes the lead prosecutor, much to their disappointment. Morales tells them that the deaths may not be homicides as they believe. Soon after, Butcher and Virginia are asked to halt their investigation, as the DA's office deems it not advantageous to continue. Simmons arranges a 60 minutes interview for Anna to reveal her side of the story. She appears on national television, making it clear that her priority has always been the comfort of her patients and emphasizing that she did not euthanize anyone. She describes the challenging circumstances faced during the disaster, aiming to provide context and defend her actions amid the intense scrutiny. The conclusion that multiple homicides did occur at Memorial gives hope to Virginia, but Butcher emphasizes that evidence alone won't win the case. Frustrated by his response, Virginia asks what would be enough for him. He tells her that Anna did well in her TV interview, making it difficult for them to build their case. Simmons informs Anna that her interview made a significant impact, garnering support from many medical professionals. He also tells her that Frank Minyard wants to meet with her. Frank meets with Anna and discusses the challenges they faced during Hurricane Katrina and the subsequent flood. However, he then announces that he hasn't found sufficient evidence to classify the Memorial deaths as homicides, leaving the case in a complex and unresolved state. Virginia, growing weary of the politics involved in the case, realizes that she cannot continue working in the field. She decides to resign from the Attorney General's office and conveys her decision to her partner, who listens helplessly to the news. Her resignation marks a significant turning point, highlighting the personal toll the investigation has taken on those involved. After the investigation by Butcher and Virginia, the DA's office takes the case, and a grand jury is sworn in to consider indicting indicting Dr. Anna. We then have another time jump, this time 18 months after the hurricane on February 20th, 2007. Frank re-examines his statement about there being no homicides inside the hospital, having second thoughts due to Virginia's scathing assessment of his work. This leads to a court case where, through a series of time jumps, we learn that the jury has decided not to indict Anna after all. However, this is not the end of the matter. The decision is partly influenced by the DA's office not presenting the forensic experts' conclusions or the evidence that Butcher had worked so hard to collect. This oversight leaves lingering questions about accountability and justice in the aftermath of the disaster. Butcher vented his frustration to his wife, telling her the medical staff didn't try as much as they should to save the patients. He sighed while she tried to comfort him. Virginia went to Claire and told her she came to give her the photo back. She apologized that they couldn't do much to her. Claire told her about Emmett. Virginia went back to the office to take her things and met Butcher. They talked about how their case had gone down hills. 1 year later, Anna Pooh steps up to accept an award and delivers a scathing assessment of how the authorities completely abandoned them during the crisis. As she finishes her speech, the audience stands and applauds, except Horace, who remains seated, visibly conflicted about the situation and the events that transpired. Horace meets with Anna and expresses his belief that the patients could have been evacuated rather than her choosing to provide what he calls fatal comfort. He points to the evacuation of Rodney Scott as evidence that the patients were savable despite their weights and conditions. However, he acknowledges the challenges, questioning whether there were enough resources to conduct such an evacuation on the fifth day, given the lack of proper evacuation systems, facilities, and both human and non-human resources. He concedes that the healthcare workers, including Anna, would have needed to perform extraordinary feats to make it possible. Nevertheless, Horace criticizes Anna and the other staff members for not even attempting to evacuate Emmett, and possibly hastening to administer the lethal cocktail of drugs to the patients in life care. He reflects on the impossibility of knowing whether help would have arrived in time to rescue Emmett and the other patients if they hadn't been given the drugs, making it difficult to determine definitively whether they were truly rescuable. This ambiguity leaves a lingering sense of moral and ethical complexity around the decisions made during those desperate days.